Hello. May I have your attention, please? Hello. Okay, so there's not a real Slim Shady in the house, but I'm gonna try it anyway. Hello, everybody. I'm happy to be allowed to speak in front of you about Wifi4EU. Hello, people on the internet. So what I would like to present is a friendly introduction to Wifi4EU, which is basically what is going on when the European Union is trying to start to build public, easy, accessible, and free Wi-Fi for everybody. So I'll start with an outline of my talk. I will first present the basic idea, then why this really matters, the current state of affairs, and what can be done. So let's start. The basic idea of Wifi4EU is pretty nice. It's bringing EduRoam to everybody. EduRoam is a big successful program implemented in universities. And now the idea is to bring free and open Wi-Fi to the general population, which in principle is a noble goal because I think basically all of us are in the same business. And now the question is, how can the European Union get that done? They might have a slight advantage in funding. They might also have a slight advantage in political influence. And they, as we will see, might have a need for some specific technical discussion. How do you get that done? You start to implement a European Union-wide standard. Implementing standards is hard. Making people do things the way you like it is usually really hard. And basically, there are two approaches to get that. Either you feed them carrots, or you use a big stick. Due to the fact that we are actually living in something like civilized societies, our state is not allowed to use a stick. But since we are a free market society, there's something they can use in form of incentives, which basically looks like this. So what the European Union came up as an idea is that they're going to pay 15,000 euros to any municipality which will follow the standard that is asked for by Wifi4EU, which is a pretty nice idea. It's like, hey, you're in a municipality, it's the 21st century, you're going to build free Wi-Fi anyway, so if you do it the Wifi4EU standard way, we give you 15,000 bucks. Might help a lot. It's not supposed to pay for the entire program, it's not supposed to pay for the entire installation, it's just extra money so you follow the Wifi4EU standard. That's a pretty neat idea. I got interested into that during last summer. This really matters because EU policy has normative effects. Political arguments on local level get really hard if you want to do something different to what is the official recommendation for from the European Union to do public and free Wi-Fi. We can see that with the GDPR. It not only has effect in the European Union, but it shows worldwide impact. The big firms from the US are starting to act GDPR compliant within the US because it's much more of a hassle to derive from those standards. This might become also true for hardware built when it comes to the Wi-Fi sector. Given that the European Union is the biggest economic bloc we have worldwide, starting to produce hardware in the business sector that is Wifi4EU compliant might actually lead to entire rows of production from really big companies like Cisco and all the others. So why this matters? We have a separation of power. Wait, this is, yeah. The problem is, this might actually be worse than GSM when it comes to data security points and data privacy. This is an argument we came up yesterday at 6 o'clock in the morning after discussing it. Daniel is still working on the technical presentation for the roundtable. So the bedrock of modern Western societies is a separation of powers. Within our political system, we have the legislature, we have the executive branch, and we have politics. They all together form the state. And then the economic sector enters. if you look at this Civics 101 case, and this can be worse than GSM, that actually needs some explanation. This is best taken care of if you look at the information flow that's required to actually get private data of citizens. If GSM is used to actually access data of private citizens, the executive branch is asking the legislature for permission to get a citizen's data. Then the legislature is telling someone from the economic sector to hand over the data. And then the data is handed over to the executive branch. This sounds like, yeah, that's a theory, that's not what they're really doing, but that's the GSM information flow by the book. That really matters because if Wifi4EU is run differently, it's the executive branch itself setting up the wireless network. So it's giving the information back to itself. There are no companies involved in that. There's no private sector involved in that. And that really matters, as we can see, because providers really, really, really hate liability. I'm pretty sure that I didn't expect to say that at this conference, but in this case, the Telekom Germany is our friend. About 2 weeks ago, they got through a ruling with the higher court in Cologne telling them that they don't need to do anlasslose Vorratsdatenspeicherung, which basically means locking user data, because it's not European law compliant. Also, we can remember the Apple FBI trial, where Apple refused to hand over data to the FBI because it would make their product less safe. In this case, we're talking about the state running its own surveillance infrastructure. This is fucking scary. To talk about how things were going and why I was basically fanboying around for the European Union a lot, even though on my last Freifunk radio podcast, was because things were looking pretty good for a long time. On the 25th of October, an amendment was given out regarding European Union regulations, la 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 and la 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 la. And if you look at the authentication put in there, you find out that the authentication that seems to be specified in the legal wording actually looks like a network authentication, which is a pretty neat idea. Like if the state is providing public, trustable wireless access, it seems to be a pretty neat idea to go ahead and have the network authenticate itself to the user so you can be sure that he's not entering a honey trap, that he's not going to be hacked. You could run apps which do some kind of authentication back and forth. That really sounded nice. Things got even better on the 20th of March. I was basically feeling very glad that day, because they said that Wifi4EU funded networks will be free of charge, free of advertising, and free of personal data use. That was like, hey, wow, I'm happy. European Union, they have like a ton of people who are highly trained, who are doing a lot of work, and they're putting smart stuff into it. They just released the GDPR, which is basically giving something like privacy to its citizens. Yeah, and then stuff started getting weird. Because this wonderful line that's drawn up in the legal language and that has been announced to the press might be in jeopardy given the technical specifications. On the 24th of April, technical specs have been announced. For the first time, captive portals are introduced in the language as a unifying basically as an identifier for a network. That's a bit weird. Captive portals are mean for various reasons. Then, on the 30th of March, just before the 1st of April, without any announcement over any newsletter or anything, the technical specs got amended and the hotspot 2.0 specification was introduced into the technical specifications. Hotspot 2.0 is basically what we're going to have the roundtable discussion about, which Daniel is going to lead. He's currently working on the presentation because we discussed it until 6 o'clock yesterday night. And on the 8th of May, another point about the technical specs had been amended, which can be summarized by there's a need-to-know basis for how the applicant information is used within the European Commission, but there's no need-to-know basis for the use or the handing over of user information. This is getting weird, especially due to the fact that, well, on the 15th of May, the first call goes live. So what we can find is that we have a pretty nice legal setting, that we have a press work that is, well, what you could basically dream for. And then we have technical specifications which are rushing in less than a month before the first call goes live, which put all that in jeopardy. So the question is, what can be done? Why are we talking about this? Why is this not a European fanboy rant as a lightning talk? Because stuff can be done. In the first round, they're going to spend 15 of the 120 million euros they have budgeted to try to test to get the standard out. When you look at European Union-wide policies, this is basically making a prototype. They just try it out 1,000 times, they look what works, they try to get it back, they're looking at it. I'm pretty sure there are upcoming reviews with the with the European Parliament. Sebastian might be able to talk more about that later. And what we should be doing is we should generate an informed opinion about captive portals. We pretty much, I think, have that nailed. There's a text on the schedule that was written by one of the Freifunkers from Aachen. He couldn't join us for the all broad technical discussion, so he just nailed captive portals to the wall. It's a pretty neat argument in English that lays out why there's an inclusion problem, why there are data security problems, why there are IT security problems, why pretty much a lot of things are bad about them. The point with the Hotspot 2.0 standard is you're not only supported to be able to support the Hotspot 2.0 standard or talk to it, your device has to comply with it, which basically looks like economic favoritism, because to be able to produce hardware that's in compliance with Hotspot 2.0 and get all the testing done is something that only the big Wi-Fi Alliance companies can actually afford. It kind of leads to some kind of social exclusion, because then people, well, have to have those phones who actually are able to communicate with it to get in the use of the benefits. You can put that on a TP-Link router if not needed, but not everybody is able to afford the latest generation smartphone. Oh, and also, it's a proprietary standard and you're not allowed to read it, it's not public. I don't know about you guys, but what I really, really liked about Europe is that we don't have FISA courts. We can read the laws we were governed by. Given the fact that the way people are set up to communicate by the European Union at this point is including stuff I'm not allowed to read, and it's basically running the information infrastructure of what I basically want to use as a European Union citizen, kind of worries me. It worries me so much that I spent some time on the internet and on the telephone, and I raised up my telephone bill and talked to some people. Several MDEPs seem to be interested in this issue when you call and you say you're from Freifunk and you have questions about public Wi-Fi. I don't know why, but they seem to call back. So what do? We contacted Jan Albrecht, which is basically the crusader for, or the publicly recognized crusader for the GDPR. We talked to Julia Reder's office, Sebastian is here with us, which were very nice in giving out pointers what to do. Being from Aachen, I called the two MDEP who are responsible for Aachen, which are Sabine Verheyen and Arne Kohn. Arne Kohn's office got Timo Wölken involved, who is from Lower Saxony and also very, very much interested in Freifunk and Wifi4EU. And the ALDE group is not handling it by a single office it's talking to, but by basically the ALDE group office, which is centralized in Brussels. So we have people's interest, and we can write to the European Union and to the European Commission. They actually have this neat form out on their webpage where it says, write to us. Please, write some specific questions about how they plan to implement this. All of those go on the record, and they're not allowed to lie to us. And they're supposed to be replying within 3 days. And if they don't do so, they actually have to have an argument why they're not doing that. This might foster some interesting discussion. I also heard that people from Netzpolitik are going to be around later. Perhaps someone from Heise is willing to talk to us. So this might get interesting. To be clear about this, I think it's a really noble goal to take what has been a privilege of the academic elite and bring it to the broad population. And the legal language is very clear about it, and the press releases are clear as well. But there seem to be some nitty-gritty in the technical specifications. And Daniel and I met at this conference. We have never seen each other before. And he had this talk yesterday about more reliable meshing. And we just talked about how it would be possible, or if at all it is possible, to get a hotspot 2.0 configuration or something and something working like it on the way, so that it's not some kind of data privacy nightmare. Last of all, I would like to mention that if anyone is watching this and who's not in it for the ideological reasons, creating the data trove of logging the basic movement patterns of every European Union citizen, which is the goal if this goes live in the way it's intended, is not only a thing that hassles people, it's also a security risk. It's basically providing the information and whereabouts of every European citizen on a platter to any kind of clandestine operation. And this not necessarily need to be run by any European state. It would allow other states to track their dissidents. It would allow for people to not feel safe in Europe anymore because they can be tracked by their fucking smartphones. And I'm pretty sure that most people are not aware of that. So yeah, do we have time for questions? Are there any questions, or do we want to dive right into the technical discussion? Sure.
So we can open the floor for some questions, if you want to put them now.
Okay, no one is interested in layer 9 problems?
So if I understood you right, so basically it says that the specification contradict to the legal texts.
Well, the specifications are so broad that they allow for a lot of things which are not supposed to happen according to the legal text. If I got that correctly, especially the 801.2x, which is in the technical specification Daniel's going to be talking about in a minute, is well, troublesome at least. The question is that what we would like to have a discussion about, is there any way to get a desirable infrastructure given the technical specifications? So far they have said that you're supposed to use hotspot 2.0. If you cross out the comply part and you make something like adhere standards to, and actually use the open standard part of hotspot 2.0, which is there, the question is, what would be the second level of technical specification that need to be implemented, if there are any desirable of those? And quite honestly, I'm the layer 9 solving problem guy at Freifunk Aachen, and this is way out of my area of expertise, so we were hoping to have a discussion with you people to actually give an informed thing like, look, we looked at all the choices you can make when you're implementing hotspot 2.0. If you do it this way, it might actually be GDPR compliant and something that's desirable. If you do it other ways, it's going to blow in your face for the following reasons. But that is, I think, just something this conference can do, because I don't know wherever else we get this broad spectrum of understanding gathered to have a discussion about this. We're pretty happy with having the conference date just in the sweet spot. 3 weeks ago, I would have fanboyed about this thing and no one would have cared.
On top of this, I didn't understand exactly what the money is for. Like, the municipality may apply to receive 15,000 euros to do what exactly?
To set up a Wi-Fi infrastructure that's running for 3 years and following the Wifi4EU standards, which are pretty easily summarized by do build non-cheap, reliable, high-quality VLAN access.
But that's like the city of Florence, which is
Yeah.
like 300,000 people will get 15,000 euros to be encouraged to do an infrastructure that costs like
No,
two
it's
orders
not about encouraging you to build an infrastructure. It's built to encourage you so that your infrastructure, which you're probably building anyway,
okay.
uses the Wi-Fi4EU standards.
Okay, so it's not for making new infrastructure. It's
For making new infrastructure, and if you make new infrastructure, you encourage to use the standard, so they don't finance old infrastructure, which might be substandard. But what they're basically trying to do is like, hey, it's the 21st century. Everybody is building public Wi-Fi. So they're trying to standardize it, and to give people a reason to standardize it, they're paying him 15,000 bucks. This might not sound like a lot of money, but 15,000 bucks is having is better than not having. If you look at the application process, it's really, really slim. You basically put in the name of the person in charge, and you have a company that applies to be allowing to do that. And then you have to verify that you're following the Wi-Fi4EU standards for 3 years, and you get the voucher.
Yeah, but what I'm wondering is that, I mean, a city that already has like hundreds of access points around the city, and then they have to make them compliant to this new standard.
I think that's not what's happening at the moment. As I mentioned, this is basically the policy prototype of that thing. So what I presume, are planning to do is, in the first round, they're gonna pay you 15,000 euros so that if you set up a new infrastructure, you do the Wi-Fi4EU way. And then they basically let time take its path. And Wi-Fi infrastructure is gonna be rebuilt in every 5 years anyway. So they start with a new installation, they establish the standard, and as soon as it's getting a foothold, it's just gonna become infectious.
Okay, thank you.
That would be my reading of it. I don't know how you can install Wi-Fi for 15,000 bucks in the European Union. I mean, in Germany, that's the cost for the electrician.
Yeah, and even upgrade them or reconfigure them or whatever. So
Yeah, I think they're just testing how they can get the standard implemented. I think Janusz and Sebastian had questions. Janusz is the one right in front of you.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for the mic, and thanks for the talk. I think it's more like a point of discussion. The question I have in my mind is, why do you think that the standard is that important? I mean, we have a project budget, which is the amount of a fighter jet, most probably, like a Eurofighter jet, which is really small. We have a hotspot 2.0 specification, which major Windows will comply anyway. We have a Freifunk project, which is built on the hacker ethics, saying mistrust authorities, promote decentralization, and it's working really well. And now you have this weird, okay, this is a little bit emotional, bureaucracy coming with some weird standard, and now we care. So from my opinion, it's like, well, let's just build a cool network and maybe sue these if they collect too much data. So what's the point in supporting all this?
I think the point in supporting all this is that at some point, so there are two beliefs for me on the basic of that. First of all, I believe that a lot of what makes out our European way of life, and as much as I like basically using Freifunk to turn an entire city into a Discordian temple, is that the bedrock of being a wealthy society as we are in Europe and enjoying the privileges we have is reasonable standardization. Basically the DIN norms are what partly rebuilt Germany after the World War. I'm afraid that when we start to have European Union-wide standards, we could bring all the information, all the experience we gathered over basically a decade of running open Wi-Fi infrastructures, and put it in there and put it in the discussion of how other people are going to live. We're in the privileged position that we have the skills, the knowledge, and the understanding to run a hobby like doing Freifunk. At some point, we could at least bring in the things we see coming as problems, because most parts of the general population are not going to have spotted this by now, and we're in the first phase. It's the first time that the information is public, And if we say something now, we might be able to help build a better society we all want to live in. This is not going to replace Freifunk. This is not going to replace common networks. But what we can do is we can make the world a little bit better for everybody. And if we can do that, we should at least try. We should have tried to put in something, to have said something.
So just a quick follow-up. So why do we need to make a bureaucracy producing a sane standard then?
Because what we might be able to do is that we start to get the European Union to open up the discussion about setting the standards. So that's not done in a bureaucratic way, in a back chamber, by a group of at most 12 bureaucrats, I would guess, who are tasked with having to decide the future of Wi-Fi in Europe. We could look at those things, we could start a discussion, and we could hope to make it a free and open discussion about how the standards should look like. They're just in the prototype phase of the policy. Now we can look at them and be like, okay, you tried? We have like a decade of experience, please talk to us. There are a lot of things we can contribute. Is this basically answering your question?
Well, I'm not convinced, but it's an answer and an argument, yes.
Okay. I think Sebastian wanted to ask a question.
Ooh. Hi, I'm Sebastian.
Hey, Sebastian.
Thanks for mentioning my name twice or 3 times.
Well, you answered to all my emails, so I'm very
Psychopaths.
grateful for that.
Okay, so I work for Julia Reda in the European Parliament, and I was asked to come here to speak about originally the Radio Equipment Directive, or what is also known about as the Radio Lockdown Directive, and I think we started around 4-ish. And then 2 weeks ago or so, you contacted our office because of the Wifi4EU project. So from what I understand about the project, but I have not studied it ad nauseum as you have, is that basically Commission President Juncker announced that people were supposed to go on a Europe-wide train ride at the age of 18 by introducing free rail tickets for 18-year-olds and free Wi-Fi for everyone in the EU. What they have then put into law is the regulation that you're citing there on the 25th of October, shortly called the Wifi4EU. And I think what you're referring to as standards is what is currently in the questions and answers section. Okay, so I don't think that standards is the appropriate term for that.
Okay.
For what I understand for now is that you have to look at this as a European project. So there are 28 still member states with different legislation, with different requirements when it comes to access to the internet. From what I understand, in Germany, we don't have the Störerhaftung anymore since last 2 years ago, when the European the Court of Justice of the EU basically said that the German law that required that everybody lock down their Wi-Fis. Okay, you all know that. Good. That is a court ruling that is applicable to the whole of the EU. Still, some member states have requirements to authenticate users when letting them onto Wi-Fis. I think Italy is one, I was told, where you have to show an ID in order to get onto a network or something. Anyways, what the Commission is doing is they put in several features that might be required for the for those who apply for the 15,000 grant.
No, that's where I have to disagree slightly. They actually have one question answer where it basically explicitly states that the Wifi4EU installation has to be set up in agreement with local law. That's fine with me. And I'm very, very sad for the guys from Italy, if that's true what Sebastian just told us. My love goes out to you. But the question is if the technical implementation basically rolls that back for everybody. I think that those technical specifications should be minimal and preserving privacy as much as they can. And if there's some member states who want to have less private citizens, so to speak.
But where do you get that from? In the recitals of this regulation that you're citing there, it says no personal data shall be collected for remuneration purposes or something like that.
That's the point. Those standards seem to contradict it on the technical level. This is what Daniel was going to be talking about.
Okay, I'm looking forward to that. I just don't think that everything is as bad as you.
Well, I don't think it's bad yet. It's at the moment it's the point to say something because it might be going in the wrong direction.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, hi. I'll quickly introduce the underlying technical notions so we're all on the same page. I just have to find this ancient VGA cable to plug into my ancient network.
Daniel, can I just add some slightly information? Yeah. The solder workshop made by Electra is about to start. So I think two persons are missing to the workshop. It's held in the seminar room and there is still room for one person more. So if you are interested, please join out the room. Otherwise, we'll keep the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just quickly set up my screen so you can follow. Basically, there were two technical standards mentioned in the FAQ of the Wifi4EU page. Finally, we have the screen going. So that might be good enough. Is that readable? Yeah, cool. One of them is 802.1 X, which is an authentication standard most of us might have already encountered as WPA2 Enterprise. We know that if we use eduroam, that there are networks which are authenticated by a pre-shared key, and there are networks which you authenticate yourself, and the network authenticates itself in the same way as websites do on the internet, using TLS basically. And there's a protocol which is called EAP, the Enhanced Authentication Protocol, which is used as in order to allow various authentication methods to be used on top of TLS. Usually this is something like we know for classical PPP when we dial up to the internet, then we use this Microsoft CHAP version 2 handshake to do a password authentication as one possible example of what could be done with EAP. You could also use it with a certificate, a client certificate, or you can verify the network's identity, which is like also its minimum use. So if it's seen as that okay, you use 1.2.11.1x as a way the network authenticates itself to the device, like you verify the network's certificate, and then you don't do any authentication at all, you just do a Diffie-Hellman for keying and that's it. And the standard pretty much allows that for public free access networks. And I think that that's more of the known part of the equation, like because this standard has been around for a long time, and the one key component which I see is in contradiction with European data retention regulations is that it's all based on Radius. So Radius is an authentication system which is very, very old already. It's been around since the time of modem dial-up connections, and it's basically handles authentication and session management. So, you know, we all know if you have 2 points on an ADSL network and you try to authenticate with the same credentials, then one of the two will either not be allowed or thrown out at the time the other one connects, because you can see that each account is only used at one point at a time. And you can use it like they did in the past for classic telecommunication accounting. You can see, is it connected? How much traffic did it generate? What are the connection times for time-based accounting? Radius is usually implemented in a way that you have a central Radius server at some point, which is connected to a directory server or something which basically holds a user database. And then you're using the Radius to authenticate yourself, and Radius will take care of the session management, but eventually even hold stuff like session private keys, which can later on be used to decipher encrypted traffic over that network. So if that's used in the same way as eduroam would be used, now I had a conversation with Gregor until 6 in the morning about that, then in eduroam you know, that's kind of your employer's network. So it's a work environment. The fact that they track your credentials on every login might sound disagreeable, but in the end it's like your work network. So you're only supposed, like if you're traveling from one university to another, then your home university anyway knows that you're doing that because they probably told you to. So it's not such a big issue in terms of collecting, like tracking people's movement data, if you're using eduroam really strictly for that purpose it's intended to use. If you use it as your home internet connection, then obviously not. Yet that was not the only thing, because they mentioned this hotspot 2.0 specification, which is a specification published by the Wi-Fi Alliance. But as all documents the Wi-Fi Alliance pushes out, it's a private standard. You need to buy the document in order to be allowed to read it. And so the actual technical writing as of what the standard looks like, just like for all of 802.11, is non-public. What we do have, in order to understand what it actually is, there are people who do have access to the standardization documents, and they do free software implementations of whatever technical means are necessary to comply with that standard. So Hotspot 2.0 is basically another amendment to the 802.11u standard, which was meant to be for interworking. So in order to explain that, and what I did in order to understand it myself, and I only understood it something like 5:30 this morning, so I didn't have time to set up a very decent presentation. But what we can do now is we can just have a look at the configuration file of host APD. What are the required things to configure that you would comply with that Hotspot 2.0 spec? And that kind of tells a lot of what is the intention of that standard and which way it may be used. So the main problem it solves is the problem we all know when we scan a Wi-Fi network and then we see, oh yeah, there's a network, it might be encrypted, it might even be open, and you connect to it, but you can't really know the result of that connection beforehand. You don't know if you have internet connection. If it's part of a hotspot network, you cannot know if the credentials you have actually work on that network, like if that's part of the roaming alliance or consortium which you're using. Like if you have credentials for, let's say, Vodafone, then those might work on a Vodafone hotspot, but they might not work on another hotspot. So it's a way to announce what kind of network is that. That's here. You say this is a free public network. In case of Wifi4EU, I would set that to number 3, say it's free. So yes, it does have internet access, so we announce that. Then there's this ASRA, which is basically what used to be captive portals, which was also surprising to me to read about captive portals in the wording of the FAQ of Wifi4EU, because they already mentioned Hotspot 2.0. So Hotspot 2.0 is kind of a replacement for captive portals in the way we did before. Like captive portals, they work that they block, they allow you to connect to the network, but they block all outgoing connections. And the moment you do the first web connection on unencrypted on port 80, they intercept that and replace that request by a login page or a redirector to a login page. In that way, we all know if you start the browser, suddenly if you're in the airport, you want to access whatever, your email account, but then you're redirected to the login page of the airport hotspot provider, and they charge you $5 for an hour to access your emails. So this is not very network neutral, obviously. You have to interfere with the actual traffic in a way the protocols never intended in order to make you go to that login or terms and conditions page. So the Hotspot 2.0 specification added a way that you would know this network requires an additional steps for access. And we've all encountered that when we connect to that kind of devices, hotspot devices with mobile clients, that even if you don't open a web browser, Android and iOS shows us a notification saying, oh, you need to log in for that network in order to have internet access, even though you're already connected. So the way to signal that is part of 802.11u, which later on became Hotspot 2.0. Another thing is that even if you're unauthenticated, you might have a way to carry out emergency calls at all, or even unauthenticated. And then they have like a standard, like what type of venue does it belong to? Is it a coffee shop or something? They actually enumerated those, which is kind of funny. Yeah, no, seriously, you can see it there. Coffee shop is 113. So they enumerated all possible venues which might run public access Wi-Fi. So then there's this roaming consortium list. This is what I mentioned before, is basically each roaming consortium, like for example Vodafone, like big mobile providers, access point ADSL providers, but also hotspot providers like Freifunk in theory might apply for a number which is given to you by the Wi-Fi Alliance, and you can put that into the beacon telling the mobile client which is about to connect, here you can authenticate with credentials belonging to Vodafone, belonging to Freifunk or whatever. So yeah, but that's just a number, you just announce it. It's by no way signed or cryptographically safe. It's really just a bunch of numbers in the beacon. And continue from there, here we have the network authentication type. And this is the replacement for actual captive portals. We have it here that instead of intercepting the web traffic, we just put a URL into the beacon, which then tells the client, here you can do your login, here you can accept the terms and conditions whatsoever. Then we have what kind of connectivity do we have, which is really cool that they made it that elaborate, that you connect to this network and you have a double NATed private IP version 4 address and maybe public IP version 6, or it's unknown. So this really captures all the possible connectivity situations in a very elaborate way, which you can find yourself in. I was surprised to see that. That's actually very nice to know before you connect. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If you have double NAT, you immediately know that your voice calls won't work, for example, and it's no point in connecting to it then, if you want to do voice calls. Then you have some 3G cellular information. I didn't really understand what this is for. It basically announces the available GSM or 3G networks which are around, or which this belongs to, or I haven't understood it what it's for. Anyway, yeah. We come to that later. Why that might be needed, because most of it is not part of the original 11U spec, which is from 2011, which I'm now going through. This is all for that. The good point, which is also great, is everyone who ever used eduroam had learned that it's a hell to configure. Like, you connect to the network and then it's like asking you, this is TLS or TTLS, and you need to upload some certificates, and you go through all this really complicated connection form which looks different on every operating system, and most of the time you make a mistake, or it might work even if it's not safe. Like, you might connect to it, not giving it away, like not giving your device away to authenticate the network. And it might work because you just didn't ask your client to authenticate the network at all, and it works, so you don't care about it, but it's completely unsafe. So the great thing here is that you kind of announce, yeah, we do this very complex, which gives you a lot of freedom, EAP standard, but then what do we expect from the client to do in order to use EAP? And that, just prevents you, and like all the drop-down fields you see on Android and Windows to connect to those networks, they will disappear because the client will already know, we have to use Microsoft Chat version 2 for password, or the most incredible thing, we might authenticate using your SIM card and using the mobile provider as an passport or a single source login provider whatsoever. And so that's also being announced. So we can announce different things. That's all not so terribly interesting. Quality of service. And now we get to the new part, which is not part of any existing IEEE specification, but it's part of this currently drafted or about to be implemented Hotspot 2.0 thing, which is basically an amendment because 802.11u showed to be incomplete or not matching the requirements of the industry, so they amended it by this Hotspot 2.0 specification. So here we can basically put fancy things. We can say the operator has a name in a localized way, like in different languages. Like if it's English, it shows this name. If it's Finnish, it shows this name. And we can show exactly what are the firewalling conditions of that network. Can we do TCP? Can we do UDP? Which ports are allowed? Which ports aren't? So that also allows you to know, is that network capable of, for example, carrying out voice calls, or can I only use it for web? Can I check my emails, or is it really only port 80 and port 443 and nothing else? So the network can announce that, which is pretty nice. The network can also announce metrics, like how fast is the uplink it has, like how much bandwidth is available. Also very nice. On which channels does it operate? Like if you have a hotspot network, it's many access points. They operate on different channels. So if you're losing access to one of them because you have a mobile device, you're walking away, your client doesn't need to scan all possible channels. On 5 gigahertz, these are a lot, in order to find the next roaming access point. But it already knows it only makes sense to search on these 4, so the reconnection happens to be much faster. Now there is a very good thing which I also like, and we talked about it yesterday, and I wasn't aware that this is a key achievement. There's a way to announce the terms and conditions as a text file, as opposed to doing like an HTTP form, which is not accessible. People who don't have good eyesight might need a reader device to hear that terms and conditions, and they need to, like in the normal way we see it today, they need to read or accept that every time they connect to the network. So now we finally have a timestamp, which is, you know that you've already accepted those terms and conditions, and your device can store that locally, that I accepted those terms and conditions at the time they were last modified, at a timestamp, and when the provider updates their terms and conditions, and only in that case, you will be presented those again, and you can accept them again, and you don't need to go through this, yes, I agree all the time, but only when they actually change. And the good thing is, what I first thought when I heard the technical idea of that is, oh, so the network has to store all users which already accepted the terms and conditions. But no, you can store it on the client device, which is smart, because you can just have a timestamp, and when timestamp increases towards what you already agreed on, then you know that the terms and conditions have changed and you need to review them once again. It's actually a great idea. So then there's again a more complicated redirection URL, which kind of matches what we see for most hotspots, that they expect you to put your MAC address or some client identifier into the GET request. So they have like a templating scheme now, which allows exactly one variable, which is the MAC address. So this is possibly, because most of the hotspots just already work in that way. Then very fancy, we can have operator logos being displayed. Like if we have the scan results of our Wi-Fi networks, we can put tiny logos there in 2 different pixel formats. Useless but beautiful. Yeah, why not vector graphics? It's a very good remark, yeah. So again, like which icon element should we use? And we have lots of friendly names and shit which we can put there, again with localization. And then there's another interesting thing, which is also interesting for Freifunk, because I was asked that yesterday. I said, yeah, I read something like that, is the network can announce whether you should prefer your 3G data connection or whether you should prefer the Wi-Fi network, like depending on its own connectivity. Like if you have an access point which doesn't have good connectivity, it will announce, please don't use me for your updates. And that's kind of what this does. You can set a preference, like how well connected is that? Should you prefer 3G data or should you prefer Wi-Fi? Which is actually a nice thing we might use for Freifunk as well. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. But everything else is just, inclusion of existing Wi-Fi standards. So now if I look at that, I can imagine, even though the Wifi4EU also explicitly mentions 102.1x, we can use 102.1x in a way which doesn't need a single central radius server. It will use radius, but only as an internal protocol inside the one access point to have a little fake radius server to comply with the protocol. It doesn't actually store anything, or it doesn't actually authenticate any users. It just tracks the currently live sessions and forgets everything once you restart the device. So it's kind of good that they didn't mention you need to have one radius server, but you can have like 1.5 million of them running in the RAM of each access point, which then isn't as harmful in terms of data retention. Apart from that, obviously this specification was made for the one most important reason, that the mobile operators, who also in Germany the situation has become much worse from my perspective, worse. From other people's perspective maybe it's good, but from my perspective it's pretty bad, that the ISP market has deteriorated into basically just 2 major players being left. both of them run mobile networks and major wired access networks like cable or ADSL, and they run very large public hotspots in each of the ADSL or DOCSIS modems they put in people's houses. So this is obviously like putting a DOCSIS modem into your house, and you even paying for the connectivity is much cheaper than putting a mobile tower on your roof, because then you have to, you know, comply with lighting safety, and you know, it not supposed to fall down on anyone. You need to get a separate electricity connection. It's outdoors, so whatever birds might nest in it, and it creates a lot of maintenance. So for the mobile operators, the idea of, okay, so why not have devices in people's houses? They make sure that the temperature is always between 0 and 25 degrees. They make sure that it's always powered. They make sure that no birds nest in it. So that's, for the point of view of the mobile operators, this is of course extremely sweet, because they get rid of a very major cost factor there, because they just outsource it to their clients basically. And the problem is they already do that, but now you have these hotspots and you still need to manually connect using your Wi-Fi capable device. And even if you manually connect, given that you would usually be on LTE, your voice calls would still go over LTE. So if you have an ongoing voice call and you're in the garage and you're getting out of your car into the elevator door closes, we all know that this is the moment when the call usually ends. And now the situation has changed, because the building operator might run an access point inside that elevator, which shows that I'm compatible with all the, you know, common roaming consortiums. Like in Germany, that would be T-Mobile, Vodafone, maybe O2, and I don't know if there's any other roaming consortium operating. And then the phone will do a handover. There's a standard for that. So the voice call would seamlessly continue and be delivered over the Wi-Fi network if the Wi-Fi network is suitable for that, and the phone can know that by only the hotspot 2.0 attributes. So it knows it has this kind of connectivity. We saw that before. It allows this kind of ports. It has this kind of bandwidth. I can authenticate with the credentials which belong to the roaming provider, which might be the SIM card. So that allows a seamless handover of voice calls towards Wi-Fi if the hotspot operator actually supports that. So it's understandable that this is an interest of the mobile industry, because from what I understood, most of 5G basically just means that you're using 802.11 AC, like the most recent 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi standard, and you authenticate with your SIM card, and that, you know, that's kind of what the marketing terms of 5G are currently mean, even though there are new actual radio standards to come up as well. Like if some mobile operators now market that they are like a 5th generation network, then what they mean is actually this Wi-Fi offloading standards. So it's noticeable that this is still a very, very complex thing, considering that it's a network protocol. There's stuff like image files and Unicode localization text in there, which is uncommon for a network protocol. So implementing that in a way that both the client and the server side is kind of waterproof is not an easy task at all, because you need to take care of many things, especially because of all the localization, URL schemes and image files and stuff like that being processed. There's definitely, like, by magnitudes more attack surface than on any other current Wi-Fi standard I've seen. Oh, I'm sorry. Just re-enable that. Yeah, what else to say about that? The thing, what probably wasn't clear before, is that in the legal writing, they don't say that, you know, you need a device which is compliant to 802.11u or compliant to the hotspot 2.0 standard. They deliberately mentioned the Wi-Fi Alliance Hotspot 2.0 Passpoint certification, which is a commercial certification program which a Wi-Fi device has to go through in order to show the logo on the box. Only very expensive devices will have that, like access points in the range of $500 and more. They will have that certification stamp on them, and only big enterprises will be able to afford the certification and manufacture access points, even though technically you could implement that on every shitty access point you could find. Like, it's not a very crazy technical requirement which requires different hardware, for example, than what we got now. We can do that on the cheapest of today's hardware without any big problem arising from that. The real question is just, is the authentication a mandatory part? Do they imagine the different existing roaming consortiums to participate in this Wi-Fi4EU thing so that Vodafone and Telecom and whoever can offload their voice calls to it? I kind of know that there is some hope in the smaller ISP markets that now there's only 2 big providers left. How do they get a piece of the cake? Like, how do they actually acquire clients? So that might be a way for small-scale ISPs or even municipalities to acquire clients and then bill the roaming consortium this client belongs to for the traffic generated or something like that, which obviously creates a huge accounting overhead if you actually want to do it. And if you have all that accounting overhead, then again you have this data retention problem, because then you have to store all that information, who used how much traffic at which access point and so on. Another thing which was, you didn't mention it, but I saw it yesterday in that more technically elaborate reply which you had got, is that in addition to all this compliance, Wifi4EU also said, and it's a quote, and I don't really know what they actually mean by it, it's said that they have to run an embedded snippet from Wifi4EU, which basically means, like from my interpretation, and I don't know, maybe we should ask them, that could definitely mean that a piece of executable code which is provided by Wifi4EU has to be run on each of the access point devices. And that would obviously be, they already mentioned, yeah, it's mostly for monitoring so we can know quality of service. But it's already clear, okay, so they see all the associations. They potentially, and because it's Wi-Fi, they also see all the probe requests, which basically means all Wi-Fi devices in the street passing by with Wi-Fi turned on, not necessarily even connected to the network, because they will probe for other networks which they have seen in the past in order to find out, is that network available? So seeing these fingerprints of, you know, basically the networks which you have connected to in the past, it's a fingerprint in terms of, you know, who will have been connected to exactly those 5 locked down access points plus, you know, Telecom ICE and my hotspot and whatever. That kind of identifies even people who are not using Wifi4EU towards the hotspots. So if the hotspots run proprietary software and in addition to that run a not specified snippet of code which Wifi4EU gives you, that turns out to be a pretty scary thing to me. We should definitely ask them what is meant by that. Apart from that, the Hotspot 2.0 specification, I already mentioned that in my talk yesterday, also has some sweet things to it, because it can allow you to run a network which allows unauthenticated access to the user, but yet the user can authenticate the network. So there's a way of using 802.1x and EAP in such a way that you do EAP TLS, but you only verify the server's identity, like the identity of the hotspot. The hotspot doesn't verify you. So that would be unauthenticated access, and in the end, you would still end up with an encrypted connection, and no one else could listen to the traffic. So that might be nice, and it's also part of like ongoing different drafts, which allow something like that. And the Hotspot 2.0 specification contains that, so it would at least make sure that on the first hop link level, which is not very important if you ask me, but it's, oh yeah. On the first hop link level, it would make sure that you have encryption even though the network is unauthenticated, which I would say is kind of advantageous because it's much easier to set up than manually clicking through all this. Like, who has ever been in Congress, they know that there also we have this EAP TTLS running with Microsoft Chat version 2, and it's tricky to set up, but in the end you could use it in an unauthenticated way. Questions or remarks regarding the technical side of the story? Mike? Is there? Ah. There's a
Okay. No, actually, thank you a lot for your talk, your addition. It's very interesting. No, technically, don't have anything to ask, but I would like to discuss what do you think would happen if some Freifunk community or association would take the Wi-Fi4EU money to build a Wi-Fi system according to the specification, and then 1 or 2 years later, the association can say, okay, we tried this and we don't like it, and we go back to using a different configuration. Do you think there would be any problem with the EU?
First of all, I see the bigger problem in that currently that would be very hard to achieve for a Freifunk community, because they would have to use Wi-Fi Alliance Passpoint certified devices in order to do that. So rather than spending 25 euros on an access point and putting our own software, we would have to use a $400 access point and use the software which came with it, which makes mesh networking usually pretty impossible, or at least vendor specific. So you would roll out the classical whatever, Meraki or Cisco, or there are a few Ruckus, for example, access point solutions which comply with that spec, and you can buy the whole package. Usually they are based on a central controller, and they're using slim access points, which basically means the access points don't carry out major parts of the protocol themselves. They're basically just Wi-Fi radios directly connected to Ethernet. And then you have a big box somewhere in the middle, which is a controller, which then communicates with those Wi-Fi radios over Ethernet, and all the authentication, key management, roaming, band steering, and you name it, is all run on that central powerful box and not on the access points. Yeah, you have that, for example, in the public transport in Hamburg, where there's, I think, a few thousand access points inside the trains and inside the buses, and all of them connect to one central box in a data center, and this central box in the data center literally manages the Wi-Fi associations. It's not just the IP traffic passing through it, but literally every probe request, every association, every key change is managed in a central way using the CAP-WAP protocol. So most of the solutions on the market, which is a scary thing, which do support this Hotspot 2.0 specification, they implement it in a very centralistic fashion, because in that way the access points can be rather cheap, and the management system, all the complexity, is held in a centralized place, and supposedly that makes the implementation a little bit easier. I don't necessarily even think so, because it's just you create yourself different problems.
So did I understand you right, that there's not really a way to implement this onto Freifunk access points? And is this because of the hardware requirement, or what's the reasons?
No, because like the hardware, as I said, would completely be capable of following this 802.11u standard and the Hotspot 2.0 amendments. We do have very recent and immature, but you know, let's take a couple of months, it will be more mature, more tested. Apparently there's driving force from major Wi-Fi chipset manufacturers to have that open implementation as a reference kit, as complete and working as we would like it to be. So technically we could implement that with certain, like by using the standard in a certain way. So Hotspot 2.0 is not just a binary thing, you switch it on or off. It's like a bunch of configuration attributes which you can use. You can use some of them, but not all of them. You can use it to announce, okay, I have this type of connectivity. You can announce a provider logo, but you don't do all the interworking SIM card authentication part at all. You just use it with open authentication. You can totally do that. But if a device only supports that, then it would not pass the certification program, which also costs a lot of money to go through, obviously. And then it would not be qualified legally, or from what they now say in this FAQ on the Wi-Fi4EU page, that you would not be allowed to use it, even though if it technically fulfills the requirements of the standard, that's not enough. It has to have the stamp from Wi-Fi Alliance that this is a passpoint compliant device. And that makes it difficult because that means it needs to support all possible combinations of features and, you know, run through a test suite, which is proprietary. We don't know that test suite. You can't read it. You don't, you know, it's like you have to pay for an entrance fee to see what tests you have to pass through. And then it's like the diesel cheating. You know the tests and you comply with it. And yeah.
So in practice, this all boils down to the fact that we want to remove the sentence certified with compliant, right? So if instead of saying certified by hotspot, it was compliant with, it would be okay.
And then possibly mention the specification and not the product name of Wi-Fi Alliance. We could say it should be compliant to these and those IEEE standards. That might be much better. And also we should, you know, change that into, it doesn't necessarily need to support all the super fancy mobile offloading features, but maybe it's really cool to have a way to authenticate the access point. Yes, that's nice. It's nice to know what connectivity it has. It's nice to know what is the available bandwidth.
Do they already certify products for this standard?
Yes. The like Hotspot 2.0 started 7 years or 8 years ago, and then it's been like first this 802.11u. It was finalized in 2011, but I think it's already considered to be superseded for a couple of years now, because this Hotspot 2.0 spec, which doesn't yet have a Wi-Fi Alliance 802.11, whatever it's gonna be, maybe it's gonna be U2 or U.1 or whatever they're gonna name it, never mind.
So if I can go back to my previous question, so again, this all means that when the municipality gets the 15K, they get it so that in the next time that they do an open grant for new access point, they will put a new requirement that says hotspots 2.0.
Exactly. That this is our anticipated outcome, is that if municipalities want free Wi-Fi, they want to grab those 15 grants. So they just copy the requirements and then they look for consultancy companies to basically deploy that. And only the consultancy companies which would offer this according to this Wi-Fi Hotspot 2.0 Passpoint certification program, they would be permitted to do that, which basically boils down to only very few professional network consulting enterprises.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, I have one point that I would like to mention. I'm not entirely sure if GDPR might give us a handle there after the 25th of May, but basically the fact that your mobile provider or your ISP announces to the world that you're his customer is something that might actually be interesting to look into. Because with the current, if I understood you correctly, with the current Hotspot 2.0 setup, my phone is going to recognize for example, I'm a telecom customer. My phone is going to recognize if I walk by another telecom customer's home. That might be some information people might want to keep private. I see no reason why the world should know if I'm a telecom customer.
The world doesn't see that. If you just follow the specifications, the access point announces to the phone that I'm a part of this roaming consortium. So now, okay, let's imagine an active attacker who basically maliciously announces the compliance or the connectivity to a certain roaming consortium. As I said, it's just a number. It's not.
It's not about hacking the person walking by. It's about the person walking by knowing who is providing internet access to the home he's passing by.
Oh yeah, but that's already the case. Like
yeah,
right now, that's already the case for all the Vodafone home spots and Telecom Phone era and so on. That's if you agree to participate in these free access programs, then your hotspot at home, as I said, it's very cheap for the providers to do that, already announces the name of the ISP which you're connected to, and in exchange for that, you get access to all the different hotspots they run in other places. So, I mean, it's not, you might not want that, but right now it's like an opt-out thing. You can still tell them, I only want internet, please convert that into a DOCSIS bridge or convert that into a ADSL to Ethernet bridge, and you don't give me any hotspot features, please.
Okay. Sorry for putting in the personal question. Does anyone else have a question? Yeah.
Thanks, Daniel. It's overwhelming, the technique, but I have a little bit a question about the political outcome of all of this, because for me it sounds in my life like the American prototype of bribing through technical things have take a big foothold in in Europe. And would you like to say something about the driving forces behind these technical specifications, where the politically might go, or you don't want? You stay with the technique.
I can tell you something about the driving forces behind the implementations, because that's public information and it's not just rumor. You can read that, it's on Git, you can see who is interested in having that implemented. And the main driving force between Hotspot 2.0 is certainly Qualcomm. Like, you can see that they're the main committers, the main contributors to all the existing reference implementations. They're certainly not the only ones interested in it, but Qualcomm's role in that is unique in that sense that they're the chip makers for most first world smartphones. They're the chip makers for a significant fraction of Wi-Fi access point equipment, and they're the most significant supplier to the mobile phone industry in general, like to the mobile networks. So this company this standard kind of covers everything they do in terms of wireless communication. So obviously they would want, because they make the gear, so they would want their gear to be interoperable with their gear, not with other people's gear necessarily, but if it's a standard and they can take part in the specification as a Wi-Fi Alliance member, a key member, then you can see that, yeah, but who is their biggest clients? Like, where does Qualcomm's money actually come from? So Qualcomm's biggest clients are not private customers, or, they're obviously device makers or people who make devices using the chips and the intellectual property they're selling. Like Qualcomm as a company, they started off as a patent troll basically, and then just bought their way through the world, and now they own a lot. So the key question there is, like, if they make something, like most of the mobile phones we can buy in the market, we are not directly buying them from the device makers. We are buying them through the mobile network operators, which are giving us a selection of client devices which they like. So, and for access points it became pretty much the same. Like, hardly anyone buys their ADSL router or access point for the home. No, they just ask Vodafone or T-Mobile or whoever is your ISP to give you an access point and to operate it for you. So, and that again is very likely to, be a Qualcomm customer then. So Qualcomm mostly, in order to have good market conditions, they need to appeal to the mobile network operators. That's their key component to success, because private people, yeah, they buy an access point or a mobile phone every once in a while, but it's not like they would order millions. And mobile network operators or ISPs generally do. I think it answers your question, does it? Yeah. Very good.
So thanks for pointing out where to hit. I think a political revenue into this might actually be to go at it as for a market regulatory perspective. That you could argue that there is some kind of monopole unfolding, and this might be a reason to say that the standard should be opened. The European Commission has been rather active in leveling the playing field when it comes to that. That might actually be really hurtful for Qualcomm, that they actually got the text into the legislation. So the Market Regulatory Commission actually has a reason to go into that.
Yeah, I only partially agree, I must say, because the current situation is worse than the world which would, like in my opinion, worse than the world which could be possible by that, because at least using that specification, every municipality or small-scale regional ISPs, they could run an infrastructure which would not be nationwide. Like currently, mobile network operators, they're always nationwide, yet you expect roaming to work all over the country, all over the world, probably. And to get into that business, you need to run a nationwide network, more or less. So this specification would allow citywide players, for example, to also provide a piece of the cake and maybe even have a way for accounting, or allow clients of the mobile network operators, like the major ones, to offload their traffic onto their networks. So it could improve our connectivity, and it could give a chance to small players, given that it's implementable in a low-cost way, which currently, if they enforce, it's more or less about Wifi4EU than enforcing that passpoint certification. Just the spec itself could be actually a market opener. Could be. But it's, I'm not an expert in that, it's just a prediction. Or any further questions?
Hello, hello. Okay, we had a question we wanted to propose, basically. We could put out somehow to speak a call for participation in writing up within the standards and what we know about them, what we think that the European Commission might want to implement basically as a second layer of technical specifications. Like if you run Hotspot 2.0, please do the following things.
Yes. I think in particular, it might be a good idea to already filter the whole lot of possibilities Hotspot 2.0 and 802.11u offers, and look at it with data retention glasses put on, because lots of that spec basically only makes sense if you run a centralized authentication infrastructure. So given that if it's a free access network, there is no need for a centralized authentication infrastructure, so that would be in contradiction with data retention laws. So we can already say, okay, major parts of the specs are anyway in contradiction with data retention laws, so why do you ask device makers or people who offer that kind of deployment service to comply with a spec which anyway to 2/3 cannot be implemented in accordance to the GDPR? And we would just name those, like don't have a central radius server, it's pretty obvious, for example. But then there's a lot of things you cannot do.
So we would cordially like to invite you to the so-called Häutungskammer. We hope discussing with us might be more comfortable than being skinned alive. But it would be really great if you could join us. I think both of us actually need to eat something and take a little break, but we could start the discussion at about 6-ish. If anyone is interested, we would be happy to have you. If you can't make it, please just come and talk to us. We have email addresses and those things and are able to communicate decentralized. And we were hoping to basically put together some basic agreement and then send it to the European Commission and tell them like, hey, we discussed your program, please look at this. You wanted to add something? Okay, ask.
The users have to register to use Wifi4EU in the future, or how is it working?
That's exactly the contradiction. In the legal writing, which he presented earlier, it very much reads like it's supposed to be open, free access, no authentication, no private data. Huh? Just free, not open. Aha,
And
interesting.
with data plan or flat rate?
Flat rate. Supposedly, in order to comply with that legal writing, there is no need for any kind of authentication. Like a basic terms and conditions notification telling you, okay, you're now connected to Wifi4EU, these are the terms and conditions, do you agree? You say, yes, I agree. Your client device stores that you agree to it. The server doesn't even necessarily need to store that decision in order, it's... Even that's not necessary, why?
Even that is not necessary because there are no terms and conditions run to a legally built infrastructure. This is a unique selling point that the municipality as part of the state has in itself. They don't need to publish terms and conditions. They can just build public infrastructure and write the terms and conditions into law. They're the only ones who can do that.
It's true.
So we don't need any form of captive portals. There is no argument whatsoever to have them. Because everyone else has to agree to terms and conditions because they're subject to the law. The state itself is the only one who can put out the regulations and terms of conditions for their own stuff by announcing them themselves in form of laws.
Yeah.
And
Good
also
point,
there's
yeah,
us.
very
We
good.
can also do stuff without a captive portal and terms and conditions.
Yeah.
So you can do it if you want to, but there's no need for that. There is no
Yeah,
need for
exactly.
any form of clickboxing.
Or registration
Yeah,
at all.
Nothing,
The thing
it's
is,
not necessary.
if they follow like all the possible knots of Wi-Fi of hotspot 2.0, then your mobile device would automatically, if they announce the capability for that, try to register itself to the Wi-Fi network and use SIM or USIM authentication for that, and then offload your voice calls to the authenticated network. So if they would actually really want that, then it would automatically imply that your mobile client, if you have an iPhone 7, for example, without even you noticing, because they kind of, you know, in the old days, we had these two different bars on the top of the screen. One was like a couple of bars for mobile network, and one was like a couple of bars for Wi-Fi network. And since the iPhone 7, which follows that specification, once you have an access point around, which announces that it can allow you roaming, given that you belong to the client group of a certain mobile provider, then your device would automatically attempt registering and authenticating using the SIM card and routing all your voice and data traffic through that without even any indication on the screen whatsoever.
So this is, again, a point where a market regulation thing comes into effect. You mentioned that one way to actually bill the mobile service provider for using Wifi4EU to reroute his calls would produce a giant data trove, which is illegal but would be hard to sell by GDPR.
Yeah.
So on the other way, what could happen is that the public-run Wifi4EU infrastructure basically becomes a subsidizing program for big mobile service providers because only those can afford to go through all those pass point regulations. So what we basically do is not only we save them the trouble of sending up the lampposts to distribute their mobile signal, but we basically subsidize them by putting up infrastructure which only the big companies are able to use for free.
Yes, that's true.
The LD group likes those arguments.
Yeah. If it is a flat rate and the people can use it as much terabyte per month as possible, then they will no longer have own contracts at home for subscribed lines.
True. Very true.
I think there should be some borders.
Yeah, and that's probably where the terms and conditions come into play, because there's one thing which is in most terms and conditions of any free connectivity service or even paid connectivity services is there's a fair use statement, which basically says...
Before this gets into a 2 of 2 discussion, is there any other last question? Otherwise we can go out to the barbecue and have other people start their presentation. Is that all right for everybody? Great, so yeah.
Nice one, thanks.
Okay, next up, Sebastian.
Hi, thanks. This thing on. I just need a minute to plug in my computer. So if this is the time where you want to go to the barbecue to just then come back, then maybe now. You're getting food?